You know, in many countries, people above 70 need routine cognitive tests just to have a driver's license. Yet despite this, a bunch of 70 and 80-year-olds have been entrusted with all the mightiest militaries and 99% of humanity's nukes. Wonderful. Now, not only does that sound stupid, but statistically speaking, it is straight up terrifying. See, this comes from a study examining over 100,000 different interstate disputes between 1875 and 2002, looking at the ages of the leaders involved, finding that when they're older, things escalate to all-out war at a much higher rate. Now, if you're wondering why that might be, the likeliest explanation is that, well, leaders tend to gain power when they're in their 50s and 60s, and so by the time they're really old, they've typically already been in power for quite a long time, which very often leads to inflated egos. And couple that with the general cognitive decline that tends to greatly accelerate when you're in your mid-60s, and you have a potent combination that can easily lead to leaders overestimating their abilities to control complex situations. And without question, the greatest example of this resulting in a war has got to be Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, who for much of his 36-year dictatorship over Portugal was widely regarded as a diplomatic genius, pulling absolute miracles to keep Portugal out of World War II, where it was threatened from multiple sides, and he even made it out on good terms with the Allies. And that's despite being a semi-fascist dictator who kept a portrait of Mussolini in his office and profited mightily from fueling the German war machine. However, as the years went on and he ruled well into his 70s, things began to change. By 1961, even after the much bigger and more powerful Britain and France had just been beaten in many of their colonies over the last 10 years, Salazar, this former diplomatic genius, deluded himself into thinking that tiny Portugal was different, that they could crush their colonial uprisings, stating to Angola swiftly and with force. An idea so boneheaded, several generals and even his Minister of Defense launched a coup against him to prevent this, although it ultimately failed, and Portugal wound up in a 13-year-long quagmire that brought the country to the brink of bankruptcy, sent thousands to their deaths, and ultimately led to the dictatorial regime being overthrown in 1974. Now, this is of course only just one example. As we shall see, old age has many times and in many different ways contributed greatly to leaders making terrible decisions, including initiating armed confrontations. But to understand all of that, we must first discuss something else that's very important yet often overlooked, which is that as leaders get older, the probability of medical emergencies goes way up. Now, situations like these are incredibly dangerous, as the actions of whichever doctor is in this spot will now impact the lives of millions of people, and historically speaking, that has typically been a recipe for disaster. In 1985, the 75-year-old Tancredo Neves was a hero in Brazil. Winning over 70% of the vote, he had united the opposition to become the first civilian-elected president after 21 years of military dictatorship. However, on the day of his inauguration, Tancredo Neves was rushed to the hospital. For months, he had secretly been battling with diverticulitis, a very common age-related issue that had just suddenly become critical. Now, while the situation definitely was serious, it could thankfully still be solved with a fairly simple and routine surgery. However, that is also where Neves's doctors became a serious complication. See, all wishing to become the guy who had saved Brazil's national hero, a staggering 12 doctors maneuvered their way onto the operations team, and as things got underway, the overcrowded room turned to absolute mayhem, with the doctors clawing over each other, each hoping to carve out a bigger slice of the glory and fame for himself. The damage done by this surgery was irreversible. What should have been a fairly simple and straightforward procedure turned fatal, and within 5 weeks, Tancredo Neves was dead. Because of big egos and personal ambition, Brazil not only lost its national hero, but was also, and more tragically, plunged into nearly a decade of chaos, uncertainty, and suffering. See, the man who now became president was Neves' vice president, José Sarney, and he'd been chosen entirely for strategic reasons. As a former high-ranking military regime insider, he was an invaluable asset in Neves playing the system. However, he was also a corrupt, opportunistic hack. Under his watch, the military was able to threaten several lawmakers working on the new constitution without any consequences whatsoever. Coincidentally, the new constitution turned out very beneficial for Sarney, containing so many measures aimed at protecting the corrupt status quo that it is to this day blamed as a big reason for many of Brazil's crippling problems. However, worse yet were his economics, which followed the principles of short-term gain for long-term pain, which he used hoping that it would make him more popular. However, the pain came way earlier than expected and inflation went skyrocketing. This in turn made Brazilians so angry that they elected this psychotic, megalomaniacal, allegedly cocaine-addicted charlatan to the presidency. He immediately crashed the economy and was so corrupt that in less than 3 years he was impeached and kicked out of office. The economic mess that these two charlatans left behind would take Brazil well over a decade to finally clean up, with millions suffering along the way as a consequence. And they both came to power more or less entirely because one old man got sick and died under some very unique circumstances. Now, this could of course also happen with a younger leader. The point, however, being that with older leaders, the probability is just much higher. And furthermore, on this topic of old leaders and their doctors, there's also another angle which in many ways is even more concerning than this. See, what if instead of messing up due to the extreme circumstances, a doctor were to consciously take actions to deliberately alter the course of history? In 1919, the aging US President Woodrow Wilson suffered a debilitating stroke. For the next 7 months, he would not attend even a single cabinet meeting, as he sat alone, depressed in a dark room, doing absolutely no work whatsoever. During a time of social unrest, foreign policy crises, and major votes in Congress, the commander-in-chief was nowhere to be found. Now, if you think it's a bit inappropriate to have a literal vegetable in charge of the United States government, well, then according to Wilson's doctor, Cary Grayson, you're an idiot. See, shortly after Wilson's absence began, Secretary of State Robert Lansing came forward with a proposal, essentially trying to force the president out of office. However, Wilson's doctor, Cary Grayson, blocked it, refusing to declare the president unfit for office while publicly lying about Wilson's health. And not for any sound medical reasons, but because he and Wilson were really close friends. And moreover, President Wilson had done a lot to help advance Grayson's own medical career, and so he felt that ousting Wilson would be an act of personal betrayal. In other words, he let a vegetable stay on as president because of the bro code. And without the doctor's support, Lansing's motion soon lost all steam and fell apart, and Secretary of State Lansing was soon fired for disloyalty by President Wilson's unelected wife, who basically served as the president for the remaining 17 months of Wilson's term, carrying out the vast majority of his tasks, while Wilson just sat there putting his signature on things. Now, all of this actually also ties into a larger point about the doctors of world leaders potentially helping to keep people that are unfit for office in positions of power. I mean, I could for instance imagine something similar happening with one of these guys. Okay, maybe not the whole bromance thing, but something more coercive in nature could be realistic. I mean, would you, for instance, have the guts to tell one of these guys that they're now so old and mentally incapacitated that they should probably retire? I doubt it. I mean, in 1952, this one doctor did have the guts to deliver exactly that message to his patient and was immediately sent to the gulags. Now, of course, this does also apply to free and democratic countries, although in a softer form. I mean, imagine for a second you were appointed the personal physician to the leader of your country. That would likely be a massive career boost by making you more attractive to other rich and powerful people. However, if you one day were to urge your leader to retire and suddenly became the doctor who was fired by the president, not as attractive anymore. However, in all of this, I also feel like we're missing something kind of obvious, which is that, well, if you're the guy injecting your leader with his medicine, you're also in a perfect position to kill your leader. A fairly funny example being in 1936. The British King George V was on his deathbed when suddenly his own doctor injected him with a lethal dose of morphine and cocaine. Now, if you're wondering why would this guy murder his own king? Well, the answer is British things. See, the king was at this point already so old and sick that he was basically done for, so the doctor wanted to ensure that he died during the night so that the death would first be reported in the posh, upper-class morning newspapers instead of the far less dignified, working-class evening newspapers. Ugh. And no, I'm not making that up. Now, while cool, this example is ultimately fairly unimportant. Something a bit more consequential would take place in the year 54 AD, when following a botched assassination attempt against the Roman Emperor Claudius, the emperor's own doctor reportedly gave him a final lethal dose of poison pretending to be treating him. However, besides these two, there are actually not that many historical examples of doctors killing their own leaders. But the mere thought of it potentially happening has in itself actually had a surprising large impact on the course of history. In the early 1950s, Joseph Stalin went mad with paranoia and had all the Soviet Union's top doctors shot or thrown to the gulags, believing they were plotting to kill him. And so when 1953, the 74-year-old man suffered a debilitating stroke, his ragtag team of doctors that had hastily been assembled were all way too frightened to even try and treat him, meaning that the leader of the second most powerful country on the planet at that point died without any medical attempt to save his life, which maybe in this one particular example wasn't such a bad thing after all. However, on the flip side to all of this, there's also yet another angle, which is that, well, what if instead of killing their patient, a doctor instead were to just do their job and treat their leader? And now, when I say do their job, I mean do their job really, really, really well. Throughout history, it's been very common for leaders as they get older to try and achieve immortality. For instance, the first Chinese emperor, Qin Shi Huang, was an obsessive consumer of immortality potions and then died from mercury poisoning. On the other hand, there's also North Korea's first dictator, Kim Il-sung, who would consume weird specialty diets, have blood transfusions with young men, and, most tragically, would keep young girls, some of them reportedly as young as 12 years old, as sex slaves, believing he could absorb their life force, thereby prolonging his own life. However, what is somehow even more horrifying than this vile example is actually what's happening here in the 21st century. And it goes back to that clip I showed you just before, where the key figure is Vladimir Putin. See, Vladimir Putin has long been semi-obsessed with immortality, with it beginning in his early 60s, where he started doing all sorts of wacky traditional folk medicine stuff, notably taking baths in the blood of deer antlers. However, things would only start to get really serious when Putin entered into his 70s, and it all has to do with this guy, Mikhail Kovalchuk, who is an absolute nutcase. In 2015, he went to the Russian Senate, the Federation Council, and began railing off about how the West, specifically the US, had developed technology to create a new, genetically modified subspecies of humans that is subservient by nature and that doesn't need pay and can live off a diet of cheap gruel. Yup. Now, most people would probably hear that and think, wow, this guy is a complete and utter lunatic. But Vladimir Putin is not most people. For many years, Putin has been fascinated by this man whom he considers a genius and whom he trusts almost more than anyone in this world. So much so that in 2008, Putin tried to appoint him to the board of the Russian Academy of Sciences, who said no. What? Think about that for a second. They said no to Vladimir Putin. How retarded is this guy? But anyway, in 2022, Kovalchuk began babbling off about the potential of anti-aging treatments, and the 70-year-old Putin began salivating, immediately signing several decrees diverting billions of state research funds to these wacky projects, all the while sending hundreds of thousands of young men to their deaths in a pointless forever for one Ukraine, but who cares? Putin and his homies gotta live until 100. However, what truly makes this one example so much more horrifying than those other we discussed earlier is the fact that we live in a time period where it may actually work. Now okay, immortality probably not, and Kovalchuk's wacky antics likely won't materialize. However, what I do find plausible given our rapid rate of technological advancement is that some scientists somewhere could make a breakthrough whereby for a hefty fee, the rich and powerful could perhaps extend their lifespans by another 5 to say maybe 10 years. A truly nightmarish scenario considering the demented psychopaths currently running much of the world. And a nightmare moreover, which we may already be living in, even if all of this sci-fi immortality stuff doesn't wind up materializing. See, take a look at this number, 87.3. That is the average life expectancy for the top 1% in the United States. And if we assume that also loosely applies to world leaders as well, that would mean that coups and assassinations aside, guys like Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping can each look forward to another 15 years in power. And so, we'll probably soon live in a world where all the most powerful tyrants are so old that they have to secretly wear adult diapers. And not only is that an uncomfortable and concerning thought, but it is also, medically speaking, straight up frightening. See, at a certain point, the mental decay of the human mind is so severe that it should never be mixed with power under any circumstances whatsoever. And to truly underscore just how badly things can truly get, I want to talk a little bit about an Austrian painter called Hitler. Now okay, Hitler himself didn't get very old. However, another person who was very important during his rise to power most certainly did. The year is 1925 and Germany's former top World War I general Paul von Hindenburg is enjoying retirement at the ripe old age of 78. However, suddenly one day he's approached by one of Germany's nationalist parties asking him to run for president of the Weimar Republic. Now, citing his old age, Hindenburg humbly declined, stating that he didn't think he was fit to run the country. Now, when you have a guy straight up telling you himself that he is too old for the job, obviously you leave him alone. Right? Fine.
Hindenburg is told that only the hero of Tannenberg can unite Germany under a stable government. At the age of 78, Hindenburg becomes president and his nation begins...
Now, fast forward 7 years, Hindenburg is now 85, still president and completely demented. Many around him noting that he could no longer really focus during important meetings, that he increasingly was unable to think abstractly, and that he had become trivially easy to manipulate by those closest to him. And so, in 1932, when he idiotically lifted a ban on the Nazi Party's paramilitary units, the SA and the SS, one prominent politician wrote in his diaries, "Hindenburg seemed so terribly senile that my anger at his decree was outweighed by my sympathy for the old man." Now, having a guy writing that about his own president is in itself quite concerning, but it gets even worse when you realize that I just mentioned the Nazi Party. Oh, God. See, to a certain Adolf Hitler, Hindenburg's dementia was a goddamn miracle.
Hitler knows that his Nazi party is in danger. Torn by strife, nearly bankrupt, it is threatened by collapse.
Many people don't know this, but in late 1932, just months before seizing power, the Nazis were on the verge of imploding. A civil war between Hitler and a guy called Gregor Strasser was threatening to tear the party in two. Moreover, they were millions in debt and slowly losing steam, seeing setbacks in a series of small elections, while Hitler himself increasingly struggled to pull the same crowds that he used to. Now, of course, Hitler still had the largest party in parliament and enjoyed considerable public support. However, he would have to make a play for power soon or risk losing everything. And moreover, one really big obstacle stood in his way.
Aber auch die Ehre meiner noch lebenden Kameraden.
Hitler's election would expose the fatherland to serious disturbance. Duty commands me to prevent this.
Yeah, Hindenburg did not like Hitler. But remember how I said earlier that in his old age, Hindenburg had become trivially easy to manipulate by those close to him. Well, one of those closest to him was a guy called Franz von Papen, who himself was in serious trouble politically, and so he hatched a desperate plan hoping to save his own skin. Hindenburg would appoint Hitler Chancellor, with Papen himself serving as Vice Chancellor, the idea being to use Hindenburg's presidential powers to control Hitler. You know, to have this demented 85-year-old corpse control Hitler. What could possibly go wrong? Hindi, wake up! Hitler is taking over the government. Do something!
August 2nd, 1934. Hindenburg is dead. All of Germany pays tribute with a moment of silence.
Hi. Now, while we're talking about the Nazis, they were, as you probably know, quite violent. And that is actually quite important in regards to why old leaders are so problematic. See, a big reason why the Nazis were so violent is because many of them were World War I veterans. And 4 years of watching friends, brothers and cousins dying in artillery barrages and pointless suicide attacks kind of desensitizes you to that kind of stuff. The point being that we human beings are shaped by our experiences, and if you grew up during certain periods of time, those experiences were likely to be a lot more extreme in their nature. I mean, take for example the 73-year-old Xi Jinping, who grew up during the rule of the ruthless psychopath Mao Zedong, resulting not only in immense pain and trauma during his childhood, but also that he was shaped by one of the most manipulative education systems in history, designed to brainwash children to a disturbing degree. Likewise, the 86-year-old Ayatollah Khamenei grew up in a time where much of the developing world was up in arms against Western imperialism, but where Western imperialism was also actively ruining his own country, driving him into the arms and influence of rabid extremists who shaped him into the man he is today. And then of course, there's the 73-year-old Vladimir Putin, whom I actually want to go into a bit more detail about, because I think he exemplifies this problem more so than any other old leader currently alive. See, not only is it absurd that he was born in 1952 during the time of Joseph Stalin, but more importantly, Vladimir Putin was a KGB agent. And so, not only was he shaped by the already manipulative education system of his time period, but also, according to testimony after testimony of former KGB agents following the fall of the Soviet Union, they were themselves the most brainwashed, fanatical, true believers in the Soviet Empire. In fact, they kind of had to be that way. See, under a regime where so much as listening to Western radio or reading a Western magazine could get you into serious trouble, these guys had to be trusted with traveling into the Western world, witnessing how far ahead the free world was, and then still remain loyal to the Soviet Empire. However, blind obedience to the motherland is far from the most disturbing way in which the KGB shaped Vladimir Putin. What is far more concerning is the paranoia. See, many KGB agents were taught to be paranoid of the West, which, made sense for the Cold War. However, after the Cold War, this paranoia remained baked into the minds of many former KGB guys, including Vladimir Putin and several of the other ex-KGB guys that he brought with him into power. And this has manifested itself in some truly terrifying and bizarre ways that have only gotten worse as he has gotten older. When Putin first became president, he was fairly warm towards the West. He openly talked about joining NATO, was the first world leader to call President Bush after 9/11. He let the Americans use Russian territory for logistics during Afghanistan, and he even did this.
I found my thrill on Blueberry Hill.
However, around 2004-2005, Western diplomats began reporting a sudden change in their Russian counterparts, and dealing suddenly became a lot cooler, and particularly Vladimir Putin was very hard to deal with. And it all had to do with these three countries: Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, and Georgia. See, around this time, all three countries were run by corrupt, authoritarian idiots who were slowly ruining their own countries. And so people went to the streets, protested, and kicked them out of office in what is now known as the Color Revolutions. However, in Putin's paranoid mind, all the alarm bells went off. The West was obviously behind it, trying to surround Russia and eventually destroy it. Now, another sudden souring in relations happened in 2011 in Russia itself, after an election that had been so obviously fraudulent that one region reported 146% of its population had voted, mostly for Putin's party. Hundreds of thousands had gone out to protest, with many carrying white balloons or wearing white ribbons. The Color Revolution had come to Russia. And then, the final straw. Over 4 brutal months in sub-zero temperatures, millions of Ukrainians would fight armed riot police, shooting at them with live ammunition, eventually toppled yet another tyrant. Now, was the CIA involved in any of these events? Yeah, probably. The CIA meddles everywhere. However, to think that they were a deciding factor or anything even remotely close to it, and not the millions of people who were fed up with getting fucked over, just takes a certain paranoid view of the world. And that view not only leads to misunderstandings and frictions, but also to miscalculations with devastating consequences. In 2022, an aging Vladimir Putin sent 170,000 soldiers barreling into Ukraine, a country of 45 million, with over 1 million soldiers at his disposal, all armed to the teeth with Western weapons, which is just crazy. But Putin is not a stupid person. In fact, anyone who has ever met him has remarked how sharp and cunning the man is. However, When that intellect has to operate within this distorted, paranoid, propagandized view of the world, any Ukrainian pro-democracy movement suddenly becomes a CIA psyop, and any intelligence officer who disagrees with that is obviously incompetent and gets fired immediately. Eventually, all your spy chiefs are just yes men who sit around fueling your wacky worldview, to the point you start thinking that most Ukrainians are just so fed up with their corrupt political systems and the broken promises of their young democracy that they simply won't fight back if you were to invade. In the words of one former Russian general, we thought that 70% of the Ukrainians were on our side and only 30% were against us. And here we are 4 years later, with hundreds of thousands dead and no end in sight.